Sometimes when we try to get a politician to do something, air quote, non-political using social media, it comes off awkward and stilted.
I know exactly what you mean around trying to get politicians to act normal. And the problem is that the normal gets beaten out of politicians the longer they're in politics. Why can't they act normal? Well, they're not normal. Because when you live in an environment where every time you answer a question, you say, thank you for your question, Lee, what we've said repeatedly is, and then you go and give your whatever response. It's like, that's not how normal people talk. When normal people hear that, they're like, what the fuck is this person talking about?
It's safe to say that American politics has been stealing focus in the media lately. So if you haven't been following every development in Canadian politics, well, you'd be forgiven. But Canada is having an interesting moment, not just politically, but existentially. With their federal election coming up in a few short weeks, it's not a moment too soon. And our next guest lays it all out, after a word from our sponsors. Elbows up. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. So for empathetic and expert legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on a Tuesday morning. Oh, it's rare for me. On the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Big week of election announcements. We are obviously going to be doing our first of 6 weekly elections recaps for the Victorian, for the federal campaign. But there's also been a campaign kicking off in our fellow, I guess what we call our sister Commonwealth country.
Yeah.
I
Sister,
feel like,
I think.
I feel like Canadians are like, the Australians of the North. And to help me preview the Canadian election, I'm joined by someone who's been on the show plenty of times before. You know him. He's a digital campaign consultant to the Australian Labor movement, worked on a bunch of Labor Party campaigns over the last couple of years, and also has worked on a bunch of progressive campaigns in Canada. Jack Milroy, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Yeah, it's great to be back. Talk about my favourite subject, Canadian politics. It's very exciting.
Yeah, exactly.
Finally, my time has come.
Yeah, indeed. Well, actually, I should also say that you are a Dunn Street United States Engagement Mission alumni member as well. You were on the program last year.
I was. It was a great time. And if folks are interested, I don't know if it's still open for this year or think about next year. Definitely worthwhile.
Absolutely, there are still some spots, so you should send us a message if you're interested in jumping on the program. It's in October later this year, which in itself, who knows what will be going on in America come October, because it changes daily. I'm almost scared to open the New York Times now when I wake up in the morning. But we're not going to talk about the States. We're going to talk about Canadian politics. The campaign has been kicked off, and let's just dive into it. Let's talk about, for those who don't know about Canadian politics and their electoral system, give us just sort of the 101 on Canadian politics and how do you form government and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So Canada has a Westminster parliamentary system, just like Australia. It has, at the federal level, it has a lower house, the House of Commons, and it has an upper house, the Senate. The lower house is elected in single-member districts by first-past-the-post vote, so there's no preferential voting. And the Senate is appointed. So it's kind of a mix of the Australian system with the British system. So there's an appointed upper house, but there is an elected lower house. The difference in the lower house compared to Australia being that first past the post means that you just tally up all the votes. Everyone gets puts a 1 on their ballot, and whoever gets the most votes, even if it is not a majority, will win that seat. The same as the UK system, come to think about it.
Yeah, right. And the magic number to form government in the House of Commons is
172, I believe. It's a larger parliament than we have in Australia, which I know is something that we've talked about a lot in Australia, is expanding the size of our parliament. Difficult to do, of course, with the constitution, but bigger parliament, more MPs, less party discipline in terms of really strict adherence to party lines. You get more backbenchers speaking out, much more again like the UK system. I think it provides more colour and movement. There's more ideological perspectives represented in the Canadian Parliament, and there's always interesting fights and alliances and stuff kind of going on in Canadian politics.
and before we do a bit of a breakdown of the major parties, the electorates in Canada, I love the name of electorates in Canada, ridings. What is
Writings.
it? Do you know what the etymology of that word is? Where it comes
No,
from?
that's a great question, and I probably should know that. I don't know. I wonder if it's something to do with horses and you had to ride out to them or something. I don't know, but yes, they're ridings. In the US, they're districts, and they're electorates here. Yeah.
How many roughly constituents would be in a riding?
I believe they are bigger than our federal electorates. They're pretty diverse in their size. Canada obviously is a massive landmass, much like Australia, but I think unlike Australia, more people do live distributed across the landmass in Canada. So there are some pretty massive ridings. But look, I think anywhere above 100,000, probably not as large as US congressional districts, but there are some pretty big ones.
Yeah, that's massive. All right, let's do a breakdown of the major parties. We've got the now. This is going to be funny for all of us because for anyone in Australia that has a passing interest in Canadian politics, we're always working out what team we want to cheer for because there are two centre-left parties in Canadian politics. I might get you to do a bit of a breakdown between the two of them in a minute. But so there's the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP or the New Democratic Party, and Bloc Québécois. Starting with the Liberals, tell us a bit about who are the Liberals, what do they stand for, who's their leader, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the Liberals are I would say, the establishment centre left to centrist party in Canadian politics. They've been around for a very long time. They've formed government for, I believe, most of Canada's history, more than 50% of the time. They come out of the Liberal tradition, much more like the Liberal Party in the UK. They don't come out of a worker or union kind of milieu. But that said, much like the Democrats in the US, over time they have moved to the left, certainly on social issues, but particularly in the last 10 years under Justin Trudeau on economic issues and the role of government in the economy and in society. So they are a broadly kind of, you might think of them as kind of Blairite, or might even say Keatingite party these days. And they typically are capable of winning massive majorities under the Canadian system because they are what you call in political science literature a brokerage party, which means they can broker certain different parts of their coalition and keep them together under one big tent. So they can have inner city lefties, and they can also have Bay Street, which is the Canadian Wall Street, financial types. They can have some of Canada's booming ethnic communities in the outer suburbs of Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary, and they can keep them all together. It's no real mean feat. But what this means is when they lose, and when you layer on top of that first past the post, they can lose massively, which is what happened a few elections ago in 2011 when they actually came third for the first time ever, and the NDP overtook them as the opposition party. That only lasted one term. Before too long, they were in a crushing majority position again under Justin Trudeau in 2015. And we'll talk about this soon, I'm sure. Until really recently, like a couple of months ago, they were looking at a massive wipeout, a complete wipeout. Their polling was absolutely in the toilet. But that's changed, and I'm sure we'll come to that.
Let's stay on the left side of the parliament. You mentioned just before the NDP. So how does the NDP distinguish themselves from the Liberals as being a left or centre-left party?
The NDP is a fascinating history. They come out of two distinct movements. They come out of the cooperatives movement, which actually formed in the prairies in Canada in the mid 20th century. It was actually cooperative grain farmers and other farmers formed cooperatives in opposition to big, I guess, monopolistic agribusinesses. So there's a collective element there, but it was a collective of producers, albeit them small producers. So that's one stream that they come out of, and they also then come out of the Labor Union and former Communist Party stream in Canadian politics. So what that means today is there's not a lot of grain farmers who are members of the NDP anymore. They would all be reliable Conservatives, but they have some characteristics that are more similar to the Australian Labor Party. They now identify as a social democratic party, and they have union affiliation. Most unions, although not all, and this is an interesting feature of Canadian politics, you will have the odd union that will support the Conservative Party. You'll have some more unions that will support the Liberal Party, but you'll still reliably have kind of the bulk of the union movement support the New Democrats in any given election. Their coalition is, in terms of vote, is younger people and older people, kind of. There's kind of a split there. And there are a number of voters that will swing between the NDP and the Conservatives and won't consider the Liberals. So there's some cultural elements to their vote too, some culturally conservative elements to their vote. It's a very difficult voter base to keep together. The NDP also does not do well historically in the province of Quebec. And that means, Quebec being 1/3 of the country, that means it's very, very hard for them to ever get, a big swag of seats without winning seats in Quebec. So that's one key element to thinking about the NDP is that the Liberals always competitive in Quebec, Conservatives somewhat, and then the Bloc Québécois, which is the Quebec Nationalist Party, are very competitive in Quebec. The NDP not so.
It's always a bit awkward because both the NDP and the Liberals are affiliated to Global Progress, which is sort of the international fraternity for social democratic and Labor parties around the world, in which the Labor Party in Australia and the Labor Party in New Zealand and SPD and all the SocDems in Europe are members of. And if you ever go to any of these international kind of meetings, and if both there's a social element to it as well. Obviously, we all go for dinner and beers afterwards. It's always a bit weird if both the NDP and the Liberals send someone. It's like, I don't know which one to talk to.
Well, and they, typically the hate between the Liberals and the NDP is, the hate from the NDP towards the Liberals is strong. The Liberals would say, I don't think about you at all. But that's definitely a tension. Absolutely. And there's another wrinkle to it too, which is that, obviously at the federal level, the NDP has never formed government. They're not a party of government at the federal level. Some might call them a protest party. You might more charitably call them a leverage party. They supported the Trudeau government in this last term of parliament in his minority government and were able to put through some really great reforms, like a national pharmacare program, which is kind of similar to our PBS, which didn't exist before. So they were able to leverage their numbers really well there. But at the provincial level, certainly in the West, the NDP is a party of government. They currently form government in the province of British Columbia, and I worked on the campaign where the NDP won that back in 2017, and they're still in power now. And in the province of Manitoba, which is in the prairies, they're currently in government as well. But the character of provincial New Democratic parties is different to the federal New Democratic Party, even though technically everyone's a member of the same party. They tend to govern more like you might expect a Liberal Party to govern at a federal level provincially. So there is some disconnect between the positions taken and the general vibe of the NDP federally and their kind of general vibe provincially, where they are a serious party of government and they need to kind of act as such.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's look at the other side and start with the Conservatives. Tell us about them. I'm assuming they're just like your good old-fashioned Tories, right?
Yeah, they are. Look, the Conservatives have, historically, the Canadian Conservatives had a big faction of what you might call red Tories in them. Mostly they came out of the maritime provinces, so that's like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and then also in Ontario as well. So there was a big faction in the Conservative Party for a long time that was much more moderate. like seriously moderate. I don't think we really had anything like that within our Tory party here in Australia. To the same degree, we'd often have one or two of the wets, but they had a big faction. It was core to the Conservative identity that they were they believed in slow progress, and in fact, they were called the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada for a long time. But always pro-business, anti-labor in most cases. Over time, as with all trends politically, they have moved further to the right, and that was accelerated under the current leader, Pierre Poilievre, who is a hard right ideologue, student politician who went into parliament, very, very early, has never held any other job in his life. And he really capitalized on the post-COVID, kind of malaise that everyone has felt across the Western world, and was able to kind of leverage that into a real anti-Justin Trudeau sentiment, which had them in a winning position for, 2 years until, it all came crashing down at the start of this year.
And the last group I want to ask you about, but if there's any others you want to sort of name as well, then please do. Bloc Québécois, which is obviously the I was going to call them the separatist movement, but
nationalist. I think they are French. They're Quebec nationalists. Their platform is based around independence and statehood for the province of Quebec. They have interesting politics on other kind of issues, much like you might expect from a kind of broadly centrist, slightly centre-right, French or European party. They are not anti-state in a lot of ways. In fact, they often, in terms of social politics, will attempt to use the power of the state. They're not anti-union particularly. They take different positions kind of issue by issue, but they're certainly not hard right, and you wouldn't really classify them as being on the left either. But their number one issue is sovereignty for the province of Quebec.
I mean, I remember as a younger person that topic internally within Canadian domestic politics hit a peak because they ran a number of referendums, didn't they? And they kept on getting closer and closer and closer. And there was one particular one I remember, you'll probably know the name of the year, but where it was just like literally just defeated.
Yes.
But since then, I feel like, am I right in saying that this topic has just kind of fallen by the wayside somewhat?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, these things ebb and flow, much like in Scotland, where they got pretty close, and then it kind of dropped off the agenda for a while, but may be coming back now. It certainly dropped off the agenda for a while in Quebec. There's all sorts of reasons why it would be very difficult for Quebec to separate from Canada. But it is a deeply held belief for a lot of Quebecois that they are an independent nation. Quebec has some special status under the Canadian Constitution to determine its own affairs. It's a province, but it also gets some leeway. So I think that's the settlement that the Liberal Party in particular, which does win seats in Quebec and has a big Quebec caucus, but they're not Quebec nationalists. So there's no nationalists in the Liberal Party, for example. That's the position that they take, which is we want to keep you in, and we're willing to give you some concessions in order to do that. But they don't run candidates outside of Quebec, obviously.
Yeah. So I guess if you're a member of the Liberal caucus coming out of Quebec, or even if you're a voter of the Liberal Party in Quebec, it's sort of a bit similar to how the position of the Scottish Labour caucus positioned themselves within Westminster in terms of sort of pushing for devolution back in the early days of the Blair government.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned before, you gave a bit of a teaser that coming out of COVID, the Conservatives were polling very, very well. And Justin Trudeau was very much on the nose. And then we had this flip. First of all, why was Trudeau and the Liberal government struggling so much in the polls? What was feeding this? But also, why was there this shift naturally to the Conservatives? What were they saying that was so popular amongst the voting population?
Well, look, so just to set the scene for where we were at the end of last year. So the polling average at the end of last year had the Conservatives at 45%, the Liberal Party at 20%, the NDP at 19%, so essentially neck and neck, and then the Bloc is down at 10, and it goes down from there. So 45 to the Conservatives, 20 to the Liberals, and where we are today is a polling average of the Liberals at 42, the Conservatives at 38, and the NDP at 9. So there's been a complete, if you look at this on a graph, they just completely cross over. So the Liberals were in absolute wipeout territory. Like, they were going to lose, potentially, depending on the distribution of that vote, they could have been in third place. They could have been reduced to 30 or 40 MPs. It would have been absolutely devastating. So why was Trudeau in that position? He'd been Prime Minister for 10 years. He'd led the country through COVID, through an entire Trump term. He was suffering the same thing that Joe Biden suffered, and the same thing that the Labor Party suffered a bit here, which is the inflation, the politics of inflation and cost of living. So he was just really struggling to cut through at that point, and he was refusing to go, and he basically was deposed by his deputy prime minister and finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, who essentially led a rebellion when she resigned from cabinet. That over the Canadian winter of last year, so December into January, led to his resignation and a leadership contest. And the Conservatives, for their part, Poilievre had been running for a number of years as a kind of MAGA adjacent political figure, really hard-edged, really negative, not outwardly Trumpian, but like pretty close to it. And he, to give him some due, there were some areas that he was good on, at least in his presentation, probably not in the detail of the policy. He was a pretty avowed YIMBY, and he made a lot of political capital off the slow rate of building housing in Canada that they were having at the time. And so he was able to really move a whole bunch of younger voters towards him who are really suffering, not only from the cost of living crisis, but from the fact that if you're a Gen Z or, even a millennial, like, you just can't get ahead. And people just were like, we've had this Trudeau guy for 10 years. We all loved him. He was the Canadian Obama, and look where we are. We can't afford anything, and we can't afford a house, and rent goes up like crazy. So yeah, let's just try this. Let's just try this other guy. I think that's where they were. But obviously, as politics changed, Poilievre has fallen completely out of favor with the times.
It is fascinating to look at the poll tracker and just see how the Liberal Party's fortunes have completely turned around since Trudeau announced that he was resigning from the Prime Ministership, and then they had this open election, internal party election to select the new leader, and then therefore become the de facto Prime Minister and lead off the election. I just wonder, just play this out in Australian politics. Could you imagine, because under the new rules of the federal, the Australian Labor Party, we select if there's a contest between two candidates, it has to go to a vote of both the party membership as well as the caucus. And I'm assuming it obviously is similar rules with the Canadian Liberal Party. So they have, whilst they're in government and Trudeau is still the sitting Prime Minister, there's this membership ballot that is taking place. And I want to get a sense from you, how did that go down in Canadian, in the Canadian voting public? Are they like, because, I just wonder how that plays out in Australia. I just feel like Australian voters would be like, hang on a minute, we vote for the Prime Minister. Why are we leaving up to 100,000 Labor Party members to decide who the next leader of our country is? Just the optics of it would look bad. But how does that look in Canadian politics?
Yeah. I mean, I think the frame that they have on it is that it's less bad than, 70 MPs choosing, which is what we've done historically when we've changed prime ministers during a term of office many times.
Overnight sometimes.
Exactly, overnight. I mean, I think it's way less democratic. So the party leadership, the party determines the way they elect the leader, and the party determines that they want to have rank and file ballot for their leader. And now, so I guess the answer to your question is it's culturally more normal to have these sort of ballots because they happen every time there's a leadership change in the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, the New Democratic Party, the Green Party, and I presume the Bloc. they all elect their leaders through a one member, one vote ballot, and when you hear that as an ALP person, you think, oh, okay, so that's only if you've joined like 9 years ago and been to 13 meetings and, thrown salt over your shoulder and turned around 3 times and spat or whatever ridiculous,
Jack,
preconditions.
Jack, were you at some stage a member of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Labor Party?
At some stage I was. I mean, it's more democratic than my current branch in Tasmania, but that's for another podcast. But it's culturally normal. It's seen as a good thing that anyone can take out a party membership and vote in their party leadership election. So you don't have to have been a member. You can join during the party leadership period. There's a cutoff, I think, maybe 2 weeks before the ballot or before the close of the ballot, because it's a postal ballot return. So, in the Liberal leadership election that just happened, they had 151,000 members of the party vote for the leader. 151,000. Every single one of those people paid their membership fee, their $10 or whatever it is. Yeah. There's $1.5 million for the party. And many of them would have signed up as recurring donors and all other sorts of things. They would have come out to events. How was it received? It was received really well. And the Liberal Party just shot up 20% in the polls afterwards. So, it was a test for Mark Carney, who is now the Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party. Never been a politician before, former central banker. It's like, how is this guy going to go during a campaign? Well, let's find out. He toured the country for 5 weeks, talked to hundreds of thousands of people, got them to vote, had to organize a machine to get those votes submitted, had to actually do the organizing work. I think it's a pretty good test of whether someone's going to be able to be a national party leader, and particularly to run in an election campaign that's happening like immediately after the ballot closes.
Can't add anything more to that. I completely agree. It's just interesting, sort of the cultural norms of Canada, and something that maybe in Australia that we need to start to consider embracing more. Because, you think about it, we've only had one.
We've only had one, and we still have the college, right? So it's still 50-50. It's a cultural norm in Canada. It's also a cultural norm in the US. It's a cultural norm in the UK. We're the odd, I don't know about New Zealand, but we're the odd one out, really, in this.
Yeah. So Mark Carney, tell us a bit about him. You started to touch on him a little bit. So he wins the internal party ballot. Why does he win? Because initially I saw more media about the deputy. Obviously, she got a lot of media because of this moment she created by withdrawing from the cabinet, resigning from the cabinet in protest. But why did he win in the end?
He won in the end for two reasons. One, the Trudeau machine united around Carney. So Justin Trudeau has a very effective political machine, political organization that won him the leadership back in 2013, before he became Prime Minister, obviously. And they're very good at what they do, and they've won multiple elections, and a lot of that machine went to Carney. Chrystia Freeland, I think, would be absolutely right to feel extremely pissed that she did what no one else would do in the caucus, and essentially take down a prime minister who was going to lead them to electoral oblivion, and then she was not rewarded in any way by the party rank and file. So I have sympathy for that for sure. But ultimately, she wasn't a particularly effective campaigner in that campaign. And this is why these campaigns are so great. Like, you get a sense of how someone will perform in an election because they're kind of put through one. And she's a fantastic operator, fantastic minister, led the negotiations in the first Trump term around the trade deal that was signed back then. She's still in cabinet now and will be a senior member of Carney's cabinet if he's reelected. But wasn't able to really break through and excite people to get her elected. Carney himself, like I mentioned, former central banker. When he burst on, there's been a lot of rumors about Mark Carney for many years about him coming into Trudeau's cabinet in a senior role, particularly as finance minister, which is what they call the treasurer. He was also Trudeau was actually trying to recruit him to take Chrystia Freeland's job as finance minister in the last year. So not a lot of, there was a bit of bad blood there, I'm sure. And he held off and ultimately held off, I guess, until the right time. I mean, I wouldn't have expected a central banker to be able to do what he has done. And I think there's a lesson there, right, which is that sometimes we give too much credit to politics as a career or as a vocation. And sometimes the skills that you need are not necessarily the skills you develop over 20 or 30 years in politics and in parliament. Sometimes it takes someone who's a bit of an outsider. Now, of course, Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of Canada, then the governor of the Bank of England. He is not an outsider in the political, the political and financial system, but he was an outsider to party electoral politics. But just as a side note, could you imagine like Philip Lowe um, uh, running to be like leader of the Labor Party and getting 150,000 Australians to like come out on the streets and chant his name? It's kind of hilarious, isn't it?
Yeah. Look, and the two things that I've seen in the media of the new Prime Minister, Carney, has been the speech that he gave in front of the Maple Leaf flags after Trump, jacked up the tariffs and basically called into question this historic friendship and alliance between these two North American nations. So a seminal moment and a test for him as the leader of his nation heading into this election campaign. And I thought, and I want to get your reflections on that address that he made. And I thought that was a great test, and I thought he came through with flying colours. And then the other one is that Liberal Party ad, and David Finney and I spoke about it the other week in the podcast, and we put the link into the show notes, is the little ad vignette Instagram reel that he did with comedian and actor Mike Myers, both in Canadian hockey jerseys standing at an ice rink, where Mike Myers questions him, you've been living away from Canada for a while. He says to Mike Myers, are you really a Canadian?
Yeah.
And
He's
tests him.
Yeah.
Exactly. What are the 2 seasons in Toronto, winter and construction? But you, and I really want to get your reflections on this as well, Jack, because of your actual experience in digital campaigning. Sometimes when we try to get a politician to do something not air quote non-political communication in using social media, we're asking them to not use their normal voice and to be funny, or basically we're asking them to act, and it comes off awkward and stilted, like a Nick Cage film. And what we saw with Carney was I think he was being himself, and he landed it. It was funny, it was sharp, and I was like, wow, this guy's good,
Yeah.
He was just being himself, but it just got a message across about, I am here to fight for Canada. And it was well written and well conceived and well produced. And I just, I was really impressed by that. I just want to get your reflections on what you've seen of Carney.
Yeah. I thought that ad was great, and they've all that reel was great, and they've got more of it that keeps coming out. So they obviously filmed a bunch of it. They filmed him on the ice as well. They filmed a few different parts of it. I think that there's a few things that make what you're saying correct, and one is that I know exactly what you mean around trying to get politicians to act normal. And the problem is that the normal gets beaten out of politicians the longer they're in politics. So why can't they act normal? Well, they're not normal. Like, that's just kind of the way it is. Because when you live in an environment where every time you answer a question, you say, thank you for your question, Lee, what we've said repeatedly is, and then you go and give your whatever response. It's like, that's not how normal people talk. And when normal people hear that, they're like, what the fuck is this person talking about?
Yeah. Could you imagine doing that at the pub? Thanks for your question, Jack. If I could just take this opportunity to say before I answer that.
I know, right? Like, it's kind of ridiculous. So why did Carney answer that? Why is he normal? He's obviously not normal. He's not the man on the street. He's a former central banker. But when you're in those rooms and you're a central banker and you're being asked by the members of your board or the business community or labor leaders, hey, what are we doing about inflation? Why have you made this decision? You have to answer the question. Like, you can't not answer the question anymore. And I think that what shone through in that ad with Carney and across his performance in the last few weeks has been, he just directly answers questions, and he's cognizant of this moment in Canadian history right now, which is an existential moment. You have a autocrat president next door who is threatening annexation of your country, and it's not a joke anymore. Like, it's a really serious thing. this has blown way past the tariffs and the economic threat. Like we're talking, like people are talking about annexation and they're concerned about it and worried about it. Look, do I think it's the most likely thing to happen? No, but it's still a thing that's been thrown out there that's never been thrown out there before. So there's a level of seriousness and it applies to this election generally. And I think this is where Poilievre is falling down because he's not rising to this moment, and Carney has. And I'll say Trudeau did too in the last few months in office when his popularity shot up because of how he confronted Trump and the threat. But Carney is addressing this moment with the seriousness it deserves. And I think that ad shows that. He answers the questions. He talks to Mike Myers in a vulnerable and kind of authentic way around what does it mean to be Canadian? Can you be Canadian and not live here? What are the essential things that make us as Canadians? And, I'm a Canadian now too. What makes us Canadian and what makes us not American when a lot of people don't really understand the difference? And I think that's really speaking to something deep in the psyche. And I think that's the national psyche. And I think that's being reflected in the polls.
So let's go to that moment. I mean, obviously, unless you've been living under a rock, Donald Trump basically claimed that he wanted to make Canada the 51st state of the United States, and also said that the current trade deal that he has with Canada is not favoring the United States, and he's putting, as part of his America First policy, he's basically declaring a tariff war on Canada, and this has galvanized the country. Just talk to us about how it has been felt on the ground. How has the shift in public sentiment by Canadians towards the United States, and also then how is it manifested in coming out in the polls, obviously, where we're seeing this absolute massive uptick for the Liberals, and how it's caught Pierre Poilievre, or his name is, the leader of the Conservatives, completely off guard. Because for a while he tied his flag really to this sort of, as you said earlier in the podcast, his MAGA world, right?
Absolutely. Like the shift has been unlike anything I've kind of ever seen. I was in Canada for 6 months. As you know, Stephen, and I left at the beginning of February. So I was there for the political crisis, the leadership crisis around Trudeau, and the initial, just after Trump had been inaugurated and this all started. And in that time, and particularly in the month or two after that, the change that I've noticed among my friends, family there, colleagues, is really something incredible. It went from this kind of like, there's an election, we don't want Poilievre to win, but like the Liberals, like, they've been in for a long time. The NDP, we like them, but like, I don't know, they're not going to win. So, and to this, and even among, conservative people who are more conservative, not necessarily conservative, capital C conservatives, this rally around the flag, rally around the maple leaf has been absolutely incredible. You have conservative premiers, so the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, who initially styled himself a bit of a Trump populist, but has walked that back over the years, but still a right winger for sure, no doubt about it. He cut off power that was being supplied from the Ontario grid into parts of New England. Premiers across the country removed all American liquor and alcohol products from the stores, from liquor stores in their provinces. Like, this is a serious thing, and people are taking it really seriously. And I think politically that's been reflected, and the Liberal Party is always well positioned to take advantage of that, because the unique thing about Canada is, unlike a lot of other countries, it's actually their centre-left party that is synonymous with national identity in Canada. I guess this was probably true in parts in some Nordic countries. So for the Social Democrats in Sweden, for example, over a number of years, or probably less so now, the Liberal Party is kind of synonymous with the red, the white, and the maple leaf in Canada. And they were so well positioned for this moment to speak to national unity, and to speak to kind of the Canadian identity, that I think once they were able to rip that Band-Aid off and replace Trudeau, who a lot of people had just turned against, and give them anyone else, just anyone else, people were ready to jump back into the Liberal fold. And I think that's what's happened.
So, I mean, with this, is this going to be the topic that will dominate the election all the way up until the election? Because I've got questions here to ask you about, what are the issues that will cover this election? But I just feel like in all my research, half-assed internet research, to be fair, that I did in the days leading up to today's episode, that's basically what people are talking about. This is sort of, it's and it's not just, the relationship between Canada and the United States and Donald Trump and tariffs and trade, but it's everything that falls off of that as well. It just seems to be the number one issue that's going to dominate this campaign.
Oh, I think it absolutely is. So you had, obviously the campaign was launched around a week ago in those circumstances, and that had been the political context for the last 3 months. Parties have put out their housing platforms today, for example. And there's we're going to build more houses here, we're going to do social housing here, et cetera, et cetera. So the normal business of an election campaign goes on, right? The policy people are doing their papers, and the comms people are doing their media releases about whatever policy. But looking at all the polling, that is not what people are thinking about right now. And we also have this other event coming up on April 2nd, which is 2 days after we're recording this, which is when the 1 month reprieve on the 25% across the board tariffs that Trump put in is supposed to come off. And it's also the day that Trump's supposed to put tariffs on everyone else. So that's just going to refocus all the attention back on this issue again, which will only be good for the Liberal Party.
Mm-hmm. So if you are the Conservatives, or even if you're the NDP, how do you get back into this game? Like, how do you communicate to the electorate that, particularly for the Conservatives, how do you unravel yourself from this perceived relationship that you have presented to the electorate, that is, I am kind of like a Donald Trump light, to recast yourself differently? But also, if you're the NDP, how do you perceived to be relevant in an election where there's no more a protest? It's actually if you're the Liberals, you're like, this is a national unity ticket. Go with the strength. Vote red and white.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what it's shaping up to be, a popular front against the United States, all funneled through the Liberal Party right now. If you're the Conservatives, I mean, you're in a really tough spot because Poilievre made his identity based on kind of MAGA light. It's very hard to walk that back now. And you still have key members of the Conservative coalition, particularly in the West. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith was at Mar-a-Lago, I believe, last week. She's ruled out cutting off oil exports into the US because, so there are still people there who, in his coalition, who are not there for turning on Trump. So he needs to turn on Trump. And he has made statements to that effect. He's opposed the tariffs and all of that. He has. But he somehow needs to create that distance, and he needs to refocus the election on essentially cost of living for Canadians and the inflation crisis. But that's going to be very, very hard to do because the inflation crisis seemed like the biggest thing in people's lives until all of a sudden there was 25% across the board tariffs, and people are worried about, their kids having to go stand guard at the border. So, it's very hard to refocus people's attention back on that. So, I mean, that's what he needs to do, though. He needs to try to wrench this away from a US focus, from the focus on the tariffs. That's his challenge. Jagmeet Singh, who's the leader of the federal New Democrats, they're currently polling in wipeout territory. They're down to 9% in the polling average right now, which is down from 20 a few months ago. Massive amounts of their coalition has left for the Liberals. This is not an uncommon thing. This does happen a lot among the left-leaning portion of their base. They, in my view, the New Democrats need to stop pretending that they are going to win the election and saying things like Jagmeet Singh is going to be the next Prime Minister of Canada, because it's absurd. I mean, it's absurd most elections, but it's even more absurd now. And I think what they need to say is, we've done great things as the minority partner to the previous Liberal government. We brought in all of these social programs. We've delivered really great progressive reforms that wouldn't have happened without us. And send us back, and we will make sure Mark Carney, the central banker, doesn't take the Liberal Party back to the right. That's what they need to say. Now, a message is one thing, but getting attention is the hardest thing in politics, and the most important thing is attention, right? We talked about Ezra Klein off air, this whole theory of attention being the most important theory you can have in politics. It's going to be really hard for the NDP to break through right now when people don't see them as a credible party of government. So it's like, well, what are we talking about here? Let's not risk the Conservatives. I'm just voting Liberal. I don't want to accidentally split the vote in my riding and have the Conservatives come up the middle. I'm going to be really careful and vote Liberal. So I think this is going to be a really, really tough election for them. Jagmeet Singh is also on his third election as leader. He was an exciting new thing, addition to the scene. Probably less so now, as anyone is after 10 years. So the challenge is to position themselves as part of the Team Canada. But, a lot of people in their coalition don't like that sort of language. A lot of people on the left, and it's the same in Australia, don't like nationalist language. But most of Canada right now is pretty happy with it.
Does Carney need to differ himself from Trudeau?
Apparently not. Apparently, whatever he's doing is crushing.
Because it's interesting to see that obviously Trudeau was on the nose, created a situation in which the party panicked, made a decision to dump him. He goes, then the Trump thing happens with the tariffs. Trudeau steps back in, even though he knows he's going, but he's still basically a sort of a lame duck prime minister, and then acts like a leader and seeks to unite the country against old bum nuts from Washington. And in doing so, his own, to your remarks, his popularity rises again, and then hands the baton over. Like normally when you do that, right? Normally when you hand over as an unpopular leader to a new person, the new person, as we saw with Harris, right, and Biden, she struggled awkwardly with this kind of like, I don't want to walk away from the reforms of what the Democrats had done in the last 4 years under the Biden administration, but at the same time, people are unhappy with Joe Biden. How do I do this? Does Carney not even have to worry about that?
He actually has. I probably spoke too soon. He actually has done two big things. He's killed their carbon tax. There was a consumer carbon tax, which was, I believe, if I cast my mind back through the carbon wars of Australian history, might be like the original carbon tax that the CPRS. I don't know. It's not like the one where they just tax businesses. It was a consumer carbon tax. Yeah. He killed that on his first day. The Liberals were also bringing in, under Trudeau, an increase to capital gains tax. Great progressive policy, really good policy. But in order to create distance, Carney killed that as well. So those were the two marquee things that he did, which are not, in my view, great policy moves. If you're someone on the left or you're a social democrat, they're not great. Mm-hmm. But that seems to have been enough for him to stem the bleeding and have people just move on from the Trudeau years. Like it really has cauterized those wounds to a remarkable degree.
There was an article I read in the National Observer, which is you recommended it to me, the publication, and actually great. I really enjoyed reading it. Actually, so I wish we had something like that in Australia.
Yeah, they do have good. They have some good independent media there. That's not like weird.
But there was one titled "Abundance Liberalism Has Arrived." And it says in the article that, Carney has distanced himself from the previous Trudeau government and captured the broader progressive zeitgeist. And it goes in to talk about Ezra Klein, who you mentioned before, and Derek Thompson's book, Abundance. And so basically it's suggesting that there's this sort of blueprint for a progressive revival. It's about the freedom. This is a quote here I'm saying here. It's about the freedom to build in an age of blocking, the freedom to move and live where you want in an age of a stuck working class, the freedom from curable diseases that come from scientific breakthroughs. And Trump has defined his second term as by demolition and deprivation. America can instead choose abundance. But what they're saying here is that Carney is sort of embracing this idea of, I guess, what we in Australia call industry policy, investing in upgrading highways and super fast trains and better schools and hospitals and creating more jobs and sort of trying to modernize Canada through industry policy, which is, I think something that if you were to regard the Labor Party as a part of this social democratic community around the world, at a state level anyway, has been very successful electorally. I'm not talking about it Victoria as well. I think it's happened in all of our states, is that state governments have gone, we're going to use taxpayer money to invest in infrastructure to fix things so voters can see the meaningful benefits around their community. Their tax dollars going to be spent on things that will make their lives easier. And now it's become this new thing in North America. What's your reflections on that?
Yeah, look, I'm a big fan of the abundance agenda, but I think the other side of it, other than the pure industry policy, pure investment side, is, and this is what gets people on the left riled up sometimes, is the removal of overburdensome regulation. So particularly, and the case that's always made is California and environmental review. Now, before people start yelling at me. Like I am not saying that we do not need to protect the environment in what we build, but we generally across the Western world have created a system where people can essentially sue or intervene in processes to slow down developments over a number of years that makes them so cost ineffective to do that they end up being cancelled. And I don't mean that in the social sense. I mean, like literally, the development doesn't go ahead, and that is often used by NIMBYs to oppose housing. Oh, we want to stop it because of this. There's a shadow thing. Oh, we get past that. Oh, actually, it's an issue with the water flow here, and there's always something else. And so the abundance agenda is let's make more available for people, but let's also let government be effective in the way that government is able to build things. Government shouldn't take years and years and years to build a train line. It didn't used to take that long. And we are kind of at a crisis point. And this goes for renewable energy too, right? And this is probably the two biggest themes of Ezra and Derek Thompson's book are renewable energy and housing. And these are things we need on a massive scale really quickly, but they're often held back by this kind of 2000s or late 1900s era progressivism, which was all about constraining the ability of government because we don't trust government. We actually have to let government be able to do these really good things for people if we say we're progressives.
Yeah. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on it itself. I've not read that book, but I'm after reading that article in the National Observer. I will be reading it, and it's called Abundance. And it's by Ezra Klein. You should read it. Like I've read a piece years ago about how long it took for New York City Metropolitan Subway to build that new train line that basically is like 5 stations that runs north-south on down Manhattan. An absolute disaster because of all the environmental protections, but so many other regulatory barriers that were in the way just to build a freaking tunnel underneath the city, for God's sake. And
it's like
California's been held up as well as a bit of a disaster case too. And these are
the high-speed rail.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I read about that the other day.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Anyway, and these are 2 liberal states. These are 2 blue states, and it's something that we're going to be careful of in Australia, because if we let the NIMBYs take control of develop, because I mean, development's not a dirty word. Development, no. I'm not in the pocket of developers or anything, but developers still build homes for people to live in. And we have regulations to make sure that those homes are big enough for them to live in, and they're not, shoe boxes and all of that kind of stuff. But at the same time, we still need the homes to be built, because we have a housing crisis right now, and people need homes.
Oh, we have a housing crisis and a climate crisis, and we can choose a process that allows everyone to be consulted all the time and have input, or we can choose abundant renewable energy and housing. There's no perfect solution to the problems we've got ourselves into, but if we're going to get out of them, we got to do some stuff pretty quickly.
The last question before we wrap up is just talk about the sophistication of a political campaign in Canada. You've actually got actual lived experience of working on the ground in Canada in terms of campaigns. What are we expecting in terms of the kind of money that's going to be spent on this campaign at a national level or a local riding level? Where are the resources going to be allocated? What does a Canadian political campaign look like, and how does it sort of compare to what we're used to here in Australia?
Yeah, so the first thing is probably the political financing scheme is an important place to start. In Canada, only individuals are allowed to donate to political parties, and there are caps on those donations at like $2,200 or something like that. Businesses cannot donate to political parties. Trade unions cannot donate to political parties. Only actual people can. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is when you get to an election campaign, there are strict spending limits. Those spending limits apply nationally and at the riding level. So the riding level depends on a range of factors, including the number of people in the riding and also the geographical kind of nature of the riding. So the big northern BC ridings that are just like massive and really spread out with the towns all across the forest, you can spend a bit more. But at the high end, you can spend about $150,000 per riding. But at nationally, you can spend $30 million. So as a party, so you can choose to do that how you like. Most parties do not spend their cap in ridings. There'll be some target ridings that will have their cap spent. but a lot of the ones that are not target, they will reserve that leftover to go towards their 30 million overall and spend that nationally on ads for the leader, et cetera, et cetera. That's the money side. Then there's also third parties, and there are a lot of election advertising third parties in Canada. I believe they can spend somewhere around 600,000 during the election period. And note that this only counts for during the period of the writ, right? So parties can spend as much as they want for the other 4 years minus 40 days in the period of Parliament. So a lot more money than this is spent in Canadian politics. We're just talking about specifically the period of the campaign here. In terms of sophistication, there is no compulsory voting. So GOTV, voter ID and GOTV is huge, just like it is in the US. Being so close to the US and the kind of interconnectedness of Canadian life with Americans, there are a lot of crossover between American campaigners. You will have folks from the Harris campaign. You'll have folks that were on the Obama campaign will all be in Liberal HQ for this campaign. There'll be some in the New Democratic campaign as well. There will certainly be Republicans on the conservative side, all within, foreign interference laws, all within the bounds of what's legal, etc. And what this means at the riding level is that the first couple of weeks of a campaign, when I did local campaigns, you're doing vote ID. So you're sending out your volunteers and your paid canvassers for any riding that's essentially a target or within could go either way. You will have teams of paid canvassers. You might have 10 paid canvassers that work full time for the campaign, and their job is to knock on doors. And they knock on doors. They collect people's voter ID. It goes back into the database. There's modeling done on the entire voter segment of the electorate, so we know which areas of the electorate are more likely to have a higher score for our candidate, which areas are likely to have a lower score. If there's additional resources, you knock on more doors, you get more data, you make more predictions. But essentially, you're asking people if they're planning to vote, who are they planning to vote for, and you mark that down. Those people are called marks, which sounds a bit gross when you think about it. And then during the last 10 days, you flip to GOTV. So all you're doing in that last 10 days is going around to people on the doors, on phone, on targeted ads, etc., and saying, hey, early voting is open. Have you voted yet? No? Okay, you can vote right here. Would you like a ride? We can drive you there. And then on election day, they do a thing called pulling the vote. So they will, by election day, you've basically identified, to the best of your knowledge, based on what people have told you and based on the Electoral Commission will actually tell you who's voted during the early voting period. So you can remove people from your list of election day targets.
It's like New Zealand.
Yeah. So basically what happens is you have, in a riding, you may have 5 what they call zone houses. And so that zone house is for a zone, for a geographical area in the riding. Everyone gets there at like 5 a.m. The zone captains will set up the day before. I was a zone captain a few times. So you get there. You've got your list of targets for the day. Your volunteers all show up. There's food. If you're in one of the big cities, if you're in Vancouver, you get it catered with like samosas and all this kind of great South Asian food that gets donated from supporters. So it's really cool. And then you send your volunteers out, and the first thing they do is they put door hangers on everyone's door. They don't knock on the doors. They do it at like 5 a.m.
Yep.
It'll say, hey, it's election day today, and you're only doing this with people who you know are going to vote for you. Yep. Hey, it's election day today. Here's the place closest to you to vote. Okay, you go back, you do another round at 10 a.m., has the hanger gone off? Oh, okay. You knock on the door. Hey, have you voted yet? No? Okay, cool. Are you going to vote soon? Yep. Okay, great. You go back 2 hours later. Hey, have you voted yet? And you just continually do that until you've gotten all of your marks and all of your targets out to the polls for that day. So it's a massive machine. The field operation that we run in Australia just pales in comparison. It's like a drop in the bucket. This is hyper targeted and at a scale of like maybe 500 people in a riding volunteering on election day, getting people out to the polls.
It's something I've always thought about, because I genuinely think that the amount of human resource that we send to stand on polling centres on election day in Australia is just not a complete waste of human capital, but a lot simply to like put a how to vote in someone's hand. I actually think we should get robots to stand near the polling center with a little tray.
We should just ban it. We should just. You can't do it in Tasmanian state elections. You should just ban it, and then it's an equal playing field.
Yeah, exactly. And then it forces all of our volunteers to go out and knock on doors and actually have persuasion-based conversations at the door, which they're more likely then to turn out and vote for you. Not turn out. They're more likely to actually vote for you because you had that conversation, because you are not having that. You are not having that conversation on the polling center. You're just not having that conversation. So all you're really doing is just give them how to vote, which they probably don't even need anyway. Anyway, there's another topic. We're at time. Do you want to make any predictions before we close out?
Oh, yeah, I'm going to predict a Liberal majority. So they'll move from minority government to a majority. I think the NDP will probably lose around half their seats. And I think the Greens will win only one seat. That's my prediction.
Okay, so the current standings for the Liberals is they got 152 out of 338 in the House of Commons. Obviously, they need 172. And the Conservatives have got 120 out of 338. Bloc Quebecois has got 33 out of 338, and the NDP got 24. So you think that the NDP will drop a fair few out of that 24, and they'll funnel through to
the Liberals? Absolutely,
the Liberals. Yeah, right. Giving them 172 and giving them government. Interesting. Jack, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate your insights. It's been fascinating. We'll look forward to having you back on later this month when we do our monster Path to 72 election episode. Those that remember in the last election, federal election, we got someone from each state to come on and just talk about what the battleground states are. Sorry, what the battleground seats are in those particular states. Obviously, we'll get Jack on to talk about Tasmania.
Yep.
So looking forward to talking to you then. Otherwise, keep up the good work and be safe.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Socially Democratic. Like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser, and get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic by following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. See you next Friday.